For more than a decade, one army held Manchuria the way a fist holds a coin. The Kwantung Army, Japan's prestige force, the empire's favoured sons, the men who had conquered a territory larger than France and Germany combined, and then dared anyone on earth to try and take it back. Officers schemed for a posting to it. Cadets dreamed of it. Tokyo pointed to it the way a nation points to its finest team, with the quiet confidence that comes from never having been beaten. It was, everyone agreed, the best field army Japan possessed. Then, at midnight on the 9th of August 1945, a single Soviet tank army drove straight into a mountain range that the Japanese had spent years calling impassable. 11 days later, the Kwantung Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. What nobody in Tokyo understood, until it was far too late, was that the mountains they trusted to protect them were about to become the exact reason they lost. This is the story of how a veteran Soviet spearhead took the one obstacle an enemy believed was closed and turned it into an open road, and in doing so unmade the proudest army in the Japanese Empire in less than 2 weeks. To understand how far that army fell, you first have to understand how high it had climbed. And that story does not begin in 1945. It begins in 1931, with a land grab that made careers and built a legend. The Kwantung Army started life as something modest, a garrison force, a handful of divisions posted to guard Japanese railway and commercial interests in northeastern China. Unglamorous work. Then, in the autumn of 1931, a small circle of its officers, acting largely on their own initiative, staged an incident along the railway near Mukden. They set off an explosion, blamed it on Chinese soldiers, and used the manufactured outrage as the pretext to seize the whole of Manchuria. Tokyo had not ordered it. The government simply woke up to find the deed done and the winnings on the table. And an army that had handed the empire an entire region almost overnight was never going to be treated as ordinary again. Over the next 14 years, the Kwantung Army swelled into something close to a state within a state. It stood behind the puppet regime of Manchukuo, the client government it had installed to give the conquest a face. It controlled the mines, the railways, the steel and the factories that fed Japan's war machine on the mainland. Its officers were ambitious, aggressive, and used to getting their way, so much so that they repeatedly dragged Tokyo into confrontations the capital had not chosen. This was the army that pushed and probed along the frontier, that fielded elite divisions trained hard and equipped well, and that carried a reputation which did half of its fighting before a shot was ever fired. When people across Asia said the words Kwantung Army, they did not mean a garrison. They meant the best Japan had. But a reputation is a kind of loan. It borrows against the future, against the assumption that tomorrow's army will be as strong as yesterday's. And by the summer of 1945, the Kwantung Army was about to discover that the loan had come due, all at once with nothing left in the account. Here is the part the legend leaves out, the part that Japanese propaganda buried, and that the men who trusted in Manchuria never let themselves see clearly. The army that stood guard over that vast region in 1945 was not the army that had terrified the continent in the 1930s. It was a shell wearing the old name, a reputation with most of its substance shipped away. For roughly 3 years, Tokyo had been quietly cannibalizing Manchuria for parts. As the war in the Pacific turned against Japan, as the Americans took island after island and closed in on the home waters, the High Command reached again and again for its strongest reserve. And that reserve was the Kwantung Army. Its finest divisions, its hardened veterans, its best artillery, and its most capable tank units were pulled out one shipment at a time and fed south into the meat grinder of the Pacific. What came back to fill the gaps was thinner with every passing season. Reservists dragged from civilian life. Fresh conscripts with weeks of training. Older men and young boys formed into divisions that had a proud number and almost nothing else. Formations that existed at full strength on a staff officer's chart and, in the field, at a fraction of it. On paper, it still looked formidable. Something on the order of 700,000 men across the theatre, arranged into 31 infantry divisions, 9 infantry brigades, and 2 tank brigades. Read that off a report in Tokyo and you would feel reassured. But numbers on a page do not stop tanks. Many of those divisions had been raised only weeks before the storm broke. Their armour was largely obsolete. Light tanks and older models that had been outdated even at the start of the war. Machines that could not survive a straight fight against a modern medium tank. Their anti-tank guns could not reliably punch through the frontal armour of what the Soviets were about to send at them. Their fuel stocks were thin, their ammunition was rationed, their training was rushed, and in many units barely begun. And the men entrusted with defending all of it had talked themselves into one comforting idea that sat above every other. They believed that geography itself would do their fighting for them. Look at a map of Western Manchuria, and you can understand exactly why they thought so. Between the Soviet and Mongolian staging grounds to the west and the rich, flat, decisive heart of Manchuria to the east rises the Greater Khingan Range. It is a long spine of mountains, steep in places, roadless in others, with a western face that falls away like the edge of a table, a long, punishing drop toward the plain below. Japanese planners studied that barrier and arrived at a conclusion that felt like plain common sense. No large mechanized force, they reasoned, could cross it. Not a whole tank army with its fuel trucks and its supply tail and its thousands of vehicles. And certainly not quickly. So they arranged their defences on the assumption that any serious Soviet blow would have to swing around the mountains, striking at Hala or at Solon, where the ground was kinder to an attacker. That is where they put their strength, and that is where they waited. That single assumption is the hinge on which this entire campaign turns. Hold on to it, because everything that follows is the sound of that hinge breaking. While the Kwantung Army leaned on its mountains, the Soviets were doing something the Japanese command badly underestimated, something almost without precedent in the history of war. They were moving an entire war across the width of a continent, in secret. When Germany surrendered in May of 1945, the Red Army suddenly held a surplus of the one commodity that decides modern campaigns: experience. It had whole armies of men who had fought their way from the ruins of Stalingrad to the heart of Berlin. Commanders who had spent 4 brutal years learning the precise craft of breaking a prepared enemy at speed. And Moscow, honouring a promise made to its allies to enter the war against Japan 3 months after victory in Europe, began shipping that expertise east. Along the single thread of the Trans-Siberian Railway, thousands of miles of it, in a movement wrapped in secrecy and stretched over the short northern summer, came the artillery, the tanks, the fuel, the ammunition, and, above all, the veterans. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky was placed in overall command of the theatre, and the plan he oversaw was a vast pincer, 3 fronts converging on Manchuria from different directions to trap the Kwantung Army inside a closing ring. The Trans-Baikal front, driving in from the west out of Mongolia, would deliver the deepest and most dangerous blow of all, the one aimed straight through the mountains at the enemy's soft interior. At the tip of that western thrust stood the 6th Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Kravchenko. This was no garrison outfit thrown together for occupation duty. Kravchenko's men were graduates of the hardest school on earth. They had fought at Kursk, where the largest tank battles in history had ground the German armoured arm down to nothing. They had driven across Ukraine, crossed rivers under fire, and internalized the brutal arithmetic of what Soviet doctrine called the deep operation. Punch a hole in the enemy line, pour armour through the gap, and then never stop moving. Drive on into the enemy's rear until his headquarters, his supply, his communications, and his will all collapse together. Speed was not a bonus in that doctrine. Speed was the weapon. For Manchuria, Kravchenko was handed a spearhead built for exactly that one job. His army rolled with 1,019 tanks and self-propelled guns. The backbone of it was the T-34-85, the finest medium tank of the war, sloped armour, a hard-hitting gun, and a reliability that let it run for days. 416 of them formed the core. Alongside came 185 M4A2 Shermans, machines built in American factories, delivered to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and now advancing under the Red Star, proof that this was a coalition war right to its final act. There were 193 Su-100 tank destroyers, low-slung vehicles carrying a gun powerful enough to gut anything the Japanese could field, and 26 Su-76M assault guns to lend close support to the advancing columns. And there were 117 BT, light tanks, older machines, fast and lightly armoured, and perfectly suited to the one thing this campaign would demand above all others: pursuit across open ground. That was the instrument, and the plan for it was the boldest stroke in the whole design. Kravchenko was not going to swing around the Greater Khingan the way the Japanese expected. He was going to drive straight over the top of it, and he was going to do it faster than any defender believed was physically possible. The Japanese had bolted and barred the front door and left the back wall entirely unwatched because they were certain no army could scale it. Kravchenko was about to scale it. The offensive opened in the dark, at midnight on the 9th of August, one day after the Soviet Union formally declared war. In the West, there was no long, thunderous artillery barrage of the kind that had announced so many battles in Europe. Nothing that would wake the defenders and hand them hours to react. There was only the sound of hundreds of engines turning over in the night, and the columns rolling forward across the Mongolian steppe toward the black line of the mountains. The first stretch was a race against the map more than against any enemy. The open steppe gave way to foothills, and the foothills to genuine climbing. Fuel was the constant, gnawing worry, because a tank army drinks fuel at a frightening rate, and the supply trucks were already struggling on ground that barely deserved the name of road, choking on dust and dropping behind. But the 6th Guards kept its foot down and refused to slow. By the close of that first day, it had already eaten through distances that the planners had set aside several days to cover, and it stood at the approaches to the high passes. Poised on the western threshold of the barrier, the Japanese thought would stop it cold. Then came the crossing itself, the passage that decided the entire campaign. The western face of the Greater Khingan is a punishing descent, roughly 25 miles of switchbacks and steep grades, a slope so severe that the tanks had to nose down it under heavy braking, engines roaring in protest, crews wrestling with the controls the whole way to keep the machines from running away beneath them. There was rain. The tracks and trails turned to slick, greasy channels of mud. A single vehicle sliding off the path or throwing a track could block a pass for hours and stall everything behind it. Every mile of it was a fight against gravity and terrain rather than against men, and Kravchenko's crews took that entire descent in something close to 7 hours. Sit with that for a moment. A mountain barrier that a professional enemy staff had studied at length and formally written off as impassable to armour, and a full Soviet tank army came down the far side of it in about the length of a single working shift. Over the first 3 days, the 6th Guards tank army drove more than 217 miles into the interior of Manchuria. It crested the Greater Khingan and reached the edge of the central plain, a full day ahead of a timetable that had already been called ambitious when it was drawn up. The advance ran so far and so fast that the army's own supply line stretched back over 400 miles to the rear, and for stretches the lead tanks were running on the last of their fuel and on whatever they could seize along the way. And still it did not matter, because nothing in front of them was ready. The men who were supposed to stop this thrust were still waiting for it to appear where they had decided it would come. That is what speed does. It does not merely cover ground, it reaches into the enemy's mind and breaks his entire picture of the war. Japanese commanders in central Manchuria had built every calculation around time, around the days they were certain the terrain would purchase for them. Days to shift their reserves, to man their prepared lines, to gather their 2 tank brigades and their fresh divisions and bring them to bear at the decisive point. The Greater Khingan was supposed to be worth the better part of a week all by itself. Instead, Soviet tanks were reported deep behind their forward defences almost before the fighting in the border zone had properly begun. Units under orders to hold a particular line discovered that the line was already hundreds of miles behind the enemy spearhead, that the front had not so much moved as evaporated. And the shock, according to the accounts of the men who lived through it, was not a shock of firepower. The Japanese were not undone by some terrible new weapon that outgunned them. They were undone by the plain, disorienting fact of Soviet armor arriving from a direction they had officially declared closed, at a speed they had officially declared impossible. The single advantage they had trusted above all others, the mountains, had been picked up and turned inside out and used as a highway against them. There is no defense against an attack that your own doctrine insists cannot happen. If you are getting something out of how this campaign truly unfolded, take a second to subscribe, because this channel goes deep on the Eastern Front battles that decided the Second World War and rarely get told straight. Now, back to the collapse. By the middle of August, the situation for the Kwantung Army had passed out of crisis and into something closer to disintegration. The 6th Guards Tank Army was loose on the central Manchurian plain, out on exactly the flat, open ground where a mechanized force does its most devastating work, and there was almost nothing left with the strength to stop it. The Japanese armor that might have tried to contest the advance was hopelessly outclassed and outnumbered. Light and obsolete tanks that could not stand against the gun of a T-34-85 or the punch of an Su-100. Whole Japanese formations found themselves cut off, their headquarters overrun, their fuel and their communications severed, their orders arriving late or not at all. The sheer pace of the drive produced one detail that tells you almost everything about how one-sided it had become. The Soviet spearhead moved so fast that at least 2 full Japanese divisions standing in its path were never able to engage at all. They were simply bypassed, encircled, and effectively removed from the war before they could fire a single coordinated shot in their own defense. An army that had been feared across a continent for a generation was not being taken apart in one great decisive clash. It was being dismantled piece by piece, pocket after pocket, as the armoured columns rolled past and left the following infantry to close each trap behind them. This is the part that still sits uneasily beside the old legend of the invincible Kwantung Army. It did not fall because it was outfought in some grand and equal battle of champions. It fell because a veteran Soviet commander refused to grant the one obstacle it was counting on any respect at all, and then moved faster than the enemy's entire command structure could think, decide, and react. On the 19th of August, the Kwantung Army began transmitting surrender orders to its field commands. Across the vast region it had ruled for 14 years, the great prestige force of the Japanese Empire began to lay down its arms. By the 20th, organised resistance in the interior of Manchuria was effectively finished. From the opening of the offensive at midnight on the 9th to the general capitulation, 11 days had passed. 11 days to undo 14 years. And the cost to the men who did it tells you just how lopsided the whole thing truly was. Set against an enemy army of hundreds of thousands, Soviet losses in this drive were remarkably light. The 6th Guards Tank Army lost far more of its vehicles to broken engines, to empty fuel tanks, and to the mountains themselves than it ever lost to enemy fire. In the end, the Greater Khingan, the very barrier that was supposed to be Japan's shield, proved to be the toughest opponent the Soviet tankers faced in the whole campaign. And they beat it too. The consequences of those 11 days ran far beyond the borders of Manchuria. The sudden and total loss of the Kwantung Army stripped Japan of its last great intact field army and of the enormous industrial and resource base that army had been sitting on, the mines and factories and farmland that had been feeding the war effort. It landed on the desks of the Japanese leadership in the very same days that the final, agonized decisions over surrender were being made, and it slammed the door on any lingering fantasy of a long defensive war fought out on the Asian mainland, any hope of trading space and time and blood to wear the Allies down and win better terms. That option, the mainland fortress, had just been demonstrated to be worthless. Within days, the war that had consumed the entire world was over. There is one detail worth sitting with as all of this settles. The Japanese officers who planned the defense of Manchuria were not fools, and it does them no credit to pretend otherwise. They read the ground correctly. The Greater Khingan genuinely was a brutal barrier, and by the reasonable military logic of their age, a mass armoured crossing at that speed, in that weather, over that slope, truly should not have been possible. Their mistake was not stupidity. Their mistake was to believe that what was nearly impossible was therefore certain not to happen. The 6th Guards Tank Army's answer to that reasoning was to treat the impossible as nothing more than a schedule to be met. That is the whole of it. Not a secret weapon, not a stroke of luck, not some flaw in the enemy no one else could see. Just a veteran army, pointed with deliberate cunning at the one place the defender felt completely safe. That decided the mountains would move for them, and then went out and made it true through sheer discipline, doctrine, and nerve. What endures from those 11 days is not the name of a single famous battlefield. It is a demonstration, as clean and as harsh as any in military history, that the deepest, strongest defense in the world is worth nothing at all if your enemy attacks it from the one direction you have sworn to yourself he cannot. The Kwantung Army spent 14 years as the pride of an empire, and it trusted a mountain range to keep it that way forever. And in less than 2 weeks, a single column of Soviet tanks came down the far side of that range and turned the empire's proudest army into a name in the history books. If you want to see how the Red Army learned to fight like this, the Eastern Front campaigns that forged the machine that crossed the Khingan are waiting for you on this channel. Start with the next one on screen.